They came with fire, with steel, with a reputation so terrifying that even the whisper of dragon-headed ships on the horizon sent monks fleeing into the woods. The Vikings were unmatched in their hunger for conquest. Except here, in the frozen woods of the far north, something strange happened. The fear shifted, and it was the Vikings who started running. In the shadowy expanse where northern Finland dissolves into the White Sea, there was a land so forbidding, so profoundly alien, even hardened Norse raiders hesitated to step foot there. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't myth, it was Biarmia. No kingdoms, no cathedrals, just ancient woods that breathed secrets, paths only the locals could follow, and a tribe so elusive it bordered on spectral. The Biarmians didn't build empires. They defended silence. And if you were foolish enough to disturb that silence, they would come for you, not in war cries and blaring horns, but like a whisper behind your ear on a frozen night. What the Vikings found in the White Sea frontier wasn't just resistance, it was resistance perfected by winter. Here, temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees C. Darkness could stretch for days. The sun might hang above the trees at midnight, just as easily as it might vanish for weeks. This was not a land for the proud and loud. It was a land for ghosts. And the Biarmians were masters of it. They didn't fight like warriors. They hunted, like predators. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence that their arrows were fletched to make no sound in flight. Silent death against the creaking hush of a snowbound forest. These weren't accidents of design. These were tools crafted for stealth, for ambush, for dissolving back into the trees before a dying Viking could even clutch the wound on his chest. But perhaps more unsettling than how the Biarmians fought was where. They did not defend castles. They didn't wait in towns, they defended the woods, vast unknowable woods, places where no road guided you, where even Viking scouts trained to navigate from the sea to the heavens became hopelessly disoriented. Contemporary Norse burial sites tell us more than sagas ever could. In normal Viking graves, warriors are buried with weapons meant for attack. Axes, swords, courage. But the further you go east toward Biarmian land, the pattern shifts. Defensive charms, protective amulets, iron pendants shaped like eyes or twisted branches. Some even contain runes. One sword hilt unearthed near Arkhangelsk bears the chilling inscription, "Beware the Watchers in the White Forest." Now consider that for a moment. These were men who laughed in the face of death, who sang as they burned towns. And yet, in this place they left warnings. Even the Norse sagas, famed for glorifying conquest, couldn't erase the Biarmians entirely. They appear in fragments and quiet admissions. The Egil saga, for instance, recounts a raid that began like so many others, loud, confident, well-armed. But as the Vikings moved inland, the forest swallowed them, not metaphorically, literally. They couldn't see the enemy, but they felt them. Arrows came from nowhere. Men fell without a sound. 30 entered. 7 limped back to the ships. The saga doesn't end with revenge. It ends with silence. This alone should alarm you. Norse stories almost never acknowledge defeat. Yet here, not only was there failure, there was a suggestion that some lands should never be touched. The Ynglinga saga echoes this warning. Go, west for glory. For the forest east belonged to those who know things we do not. It wasn't just fear of death, it was fear of the unknown. The Biarmians weren't just hard to fight, they were hard to even understand. They didn't look like typical enemies. They didn't act like typical warriors. And most disturbing of all, their women fought too. Viking culture, for all its rugged individualism, was deeply patriarchal. Raids, battle, and glory were for the men. Yet here, deep in the north, they encountered women who held command, drew bows with surgical precision, and led ambushes. Some Viking chroniclers, like the Varangian scribe Nicaros, noted with confusion, "Among them, a woman's arrow finds its mark as surely as a man's." To the Norse, this wasn't just unsettling, it was offensive. It violated the very blueprint of how the world was supposed to work. And that might have been the Biarmians' most powerful weapon. They didn't just fight the Vikings, they disoriented them. Culturally, spiritually, psychologically. The Biarmians had carved posts to mark their lands, decorated with abstract symbols and images of wolves, bears, twisted faces. These weren't just boundaries, they were warnings. Yet Norse accounts describe many of these posts not as repellent, but magnetic, almost hypnotic. The deeper the Vikings went, the more their maps failed them. The more they started hearing sounds that didn't make sense. The more they started to turn on each other. It's easy, in hindsight, to romanticize the Vikings as unstoppable, but history always has its shadows, and here at the edge of the known world they found theirs. The deeper the Vikings pressed into the heart of Biarmian land, the less they understood what they were dealing with. They were used to chaos, clashing steel, fire, and screaming. But in these woods, it was the silence that killed you. It was never a battle. It was a disappearance. From the Byzantine historian Michael Italiates to the Arab geographer al-Idrisi, outside observers who wrote about the Biarmians all agreed on one thing. They didn't move like warriors. They moved like the forest itself. Even the Rus Vikings turned Slavic traders and warlords feared to speak too loudly of them. One 11th century account claims that entire Rus patrols vanished while mapping routes through Biarmian territory. One of the few survivors told a chilling tale. "We heard the trees whisper before the first man fell. After that, there was only snow and shadows." Let's pause on that. The Biarmians weren't simply avoiding Viking dominance. They were strategically undoing it. Their attacks weren't about numbers or muscle. They were about timing, silence, and fear. They weren't trying to outfight the Vikings. They were trying to make the Vikings question whether they were even the dominant predator in these woods anymore. And it worked. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking war gear began to shift dramatically near the Biarmian frontier. Shields became heavier, not for offense but for protection. Rear flanks of armor grew larger. Some helmets from these border raids even had primitive face guards, unusual for the typically open-faced Norse design. These weren't symbols of glory. They were signs of fear. One warrior's remains, excavated near modern Severodvinsk, had 5 arrow wounds, all from behind, none from the front. He never even saw his attackers. The Biarmians' technological mastery of winter terrain was unmatched. They built semi-subterranean homes that kept a steady 15-degree Celsius inside, while the temperature outside dropped below 30 degrees. Their skis were asymmetrical, one long for gliding, one short for pushing, allowing speeds up to 15 km/h across dense snow. Faster than a Viking in full gear could run even on flat ground. And while Vikings bunkered down in winter, the Biarmians thrived in it. They hunted humans the same way they hunted elk, tracking them silently, guiding them into choke points, and finishing the job with precision. Some Viking expeditions into Biarmian land found no battle at all, just footprints that stopped, camps abandoned in haste, or worse, nothing. No signs of struggle, no fallen men, no blood, just the uncanny feeling that the forest had swallowed them whole. Even more terrifying than their tactics were the Biarmians' beliefs. To the Norse, death was sacred. You died with your weapon in hand, you entered Valhalla. There was ritual in it, ceremony. But Biarmian graves told a different story. Instead of swords and shields, archaeologists found bones laid in geometric patterns, encircled by carved stones, or antler fragments arranged like constellations. In some chieftain tombs, the dead were preserved in conditions resembling mummification, a practice the Norse found deeply disturbing. It wasn't just alien, it was threatening to their worldview. 2. Vikings saw this not as respect for the dead, but as a kind of defiance of death itself. And when you believe that the next life is only granted by a glorious death, facing an enemy that plays by entirely different rules is deeply unsettling. Even more so when those enemies are led by women. We have to understand how profoundly this upended the Viking mindset. Norse women, while respected in domestic and some mythic contexts, were rarely seen on the battlefield. Yet chroniclers like Nicaros describe female Biarmian archers in defense formations, often at the front. These weren't isolated cases. They were norms, and when Vikings returned home from these failed raids, they didn't just come back wounded in flesh. They came back wounded in pride. The sagas, the proud, boastful Viking stories that frame even defeat as heroic, begin to hint at something darker when dealing with the East. Lines like, "Seek the West for glory, for the forests of the East belong to secrets we do not speak." That's not just geography. That's dread. Some accounts from Norse skalds even suggest Viking ships would purposely alter routes to avoid Biarmian waters. They feared losing, more than men. They feared losing themselves in a place that refused to be known, and the Biarmians knew it. They marked their territory with carved totems, feral beasts, jagged spirals, human faces twisted in agony. These weren't just barriers. They were psychological weapons. They dared you to cross and warned you of what would happen if you did. And yet sometimes curiosity, or greed, overrode that fear. The most famous of these missteps came in 1026, Sabo Thorhund's expedition, 3 Viking ships, nearly 300 men, armed, armored, and confident. He had heard of the Biarmians' wealth, furs, silver, sacred artifacts, and thought them ripe for tribute. After a brief peaceful exchange of trade goods, Thor made a fatal mistake. He ordered the desecration of a sacred Biarmian site. What happened next was swift, coordinated, and brutal. Excavations near the White Sea have uncovered a mass grave, with at least 40 Viking skeletons dated precisely to the early 11th century. Many of the bones show blunt force trauma to the back of the head. Others have shallow puncture wounds, arrow strikes, indicating the men were attacked from behind. The Norse saga that survives calls it a disappearance, not a battle. Of the 3 ships, only one made it home, and even that one had so few men that young boys were needed to help row it back to Norway. That wasn't a loss. That was a lesson. You don't march into the land of ghosts expecting glory. You tiptoe, and whisper apologies and pray the forest doesn't answer back. By now, the Viking fear of the Biarmians had evolved beyond the battlefield. It was no longer about losing men. It was about losing control. Control over the elements, over time, over the very meaning of what it meant to be a warrior. And in the 3rd chapter of this chilling story, we arrive at the most devastating part. The Biarmians didn't just wait for Vikings to attack. They laid traps so intricate, so patiently crafted, that the forest itself became the weapon. One of the Norse most haunting accounts comes from Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian writing in the 12th century. He describes a Viking expedition venturing into Biarmian territory only to be led by the trees themselves. His description seems poetic at first, until you realize what he means. The Biarmians allowed small Viking groups to enter unchallenged. No ambush, no arrows, just quiet woods, and the uneasy feeling of being watched. Once the Vikings passed deep into the heartland, their retreat was sealed behind them. Trees, cut down in advance, were dropped with precision across narrow trails and frozen rivers. Escape paths vanished. Sounds echoed wrong. The forest closed in. And then came the attack. Not from the front. Never from the front. From the sides. From above. From beneath the snow. Saxo writes, "They rose from the white as if the earth had given them form. Arrows rained down. Shadows moved. The Vikings could not even form a proper shield wall. The snow was too deep, their footing too poor, their weapons too slow. What the Biarmians lacked in iron, they made up for in timing and terrain. Every step the Vikings took was planned for. Every hesitation, every path they might choose was predicted with eerie accuracy. And when they broke ranks to flee, the snow punished them. It wasn't just the winter. It was the psychological warfare. One Viking account describes hearing laughter in the dark before a raid. Laughter, high-pitched, distant, and completely out of place. Whether it was real or imagined doesn't matter. The result was the same. The Vikings lost sleep. And when they lost sleep, they lost coordination. And when they lost that, they lost lives. But perhaps the most terrifying battle tactic the Biarmians ever employed came during a winter raid near the Dvina River, around 995 CE, what Norse chroniclers called the Battle of Sleeping Fires. Here, a Viking force under by a leader named Hánason believed they had found the perfect advantage. Frozen rivers meant easy travel and direct routes into the Biarmian heartland. They brought torches and axes, sleds and hounds. They moved quickly across the glinting white. Too quickly. They didn't see the blackened pits beneath the surface. Biarmians had prepared the river weeks in advance. Beneath a thin layer of snow, fire pits soaked in oil were hidden in shallow trenches and covered with thin bark and ice. The traps were invisible. When the Vikings entered, the Biarmians waited, then ignited the snow. Flames erupted from beneath them. Confused and panicked, the Vikings rushed for the tree line, right into an ambush. Archers hidden in snowbanks unleashed volleys from multiple directions. The ice cracked under weight. Men fell through. Horses bolted. The forest lit with screaming. Archaeological teams working along the Dvina discovered these blackened pits. Charred residue mixed with animal fat and flax suggests a combustible trap designed not to kill, but to confuse, to isolate, to expose. When the Norse chronicler retells the battle, he simply writes, "The forest burned, and then it laughed." It's hard to imagine a more precise image of dread. What the Vikings failed to understand, and perhaps what we still fail to grasp today, is that Biarmian warfare wasn't about destruction. It was about invisibility. They didn't conquer villages or lay siege to towns. They erased threats, silently. And if you survived, it was not a victory, it was a warning. We see this reflected again in Viking adaptations. In the years following the Dvina disaster, their military gear changed. Chainmail grew tighter. Leather backplates became standard. Helmets covered ears and jaw lines. Even their tactics began to shift. More scouting, less overland travel, and fewer raids east. Think about that. An entire warrior culture built around conquest forced to retreat, not because they were outnumbered, but because they were unprepared for an enemy that refused to play by the same rules. And still, the Biarmians weren't done surprising them. Let's turn for a moment to the deeply unsettling discoveries in Biarmian burial traditions. We've touched on the preservation of chieftains, but newer studies suggest a broader spiritual framework that deeply unnerved Viking explorers. At one site, the grave of a presumed Biarmian leader contained not just bones and artifacts, but human hair braided into long, intricate cords, woven into circular patterns around the body. The implication is unknown, but Norse descriptions suggest they believed these were wards, spiritual defenses to keep intruders from disturbing the dead. And then there were the totems. Every major Biarmian trailhead and crossing point was guarded by carved posts, not simply art, but warnings. One such post, unearthed near modern-day Kandalaksha, shows a wolf's open mouth with a hand reaching into it, an image of overreach and the punishment for it. The Vikings saw these signs and ignored them at their peril, which makes it all the more fascinating that even amid this fear, trade between the Vikings and Biarmians continued. Silent trade zones were set up, often at the edge of contested areas. Goods were left on stones. No one spoke. No one crossed the line. You didn't barter with a Biarmian. You left your offering and waited. If it disappeared, the deal was accepted. If it stayed, you left. Quietly. One of the most remarkable finds confirming this is the Muggery hoard, discovered in 1989. Over 1,700 silver coins and goods, Byzantine, Norse Arabic, some marked with what are now identified as Biarmian symbols. Not plunder, payment. It's proof that somehow, fear and commerce coexisted, that even in a relationship defined by dread, there could be respect. And so, while Vikings wrote sagas about dragons and giants, the true monsters, the ones who haunted, their real nightmares, needed no magic at all. Just snow, silence, and a reason to protect their land. There's a moment in every empire's life when the sword stops swinging, and the map stops expanding. For the Vikings, that moment didn't come with a bang. It came with cold, silence, and a long, hard look east toward the forests they could never tame. And they stopped coming, not because they ran out of ships, not because they ran out of men, but because they ran into something older, something stranger, something that refused to play by the rules of heroism and glory. The Biarmians didn't just repel raids, they reshaped Viking behavior. They created what historians now call a resistance frontier, a soft boundary not enforced by castles or garrisons, but by fear. By repeated calculated defeats that taught even the most aggressive warriors to think twice before entering that white labyrinth of pine, ice, and silence. You can trace it archaeologically. As Norse settlements expanded across Europe, down through France, across the British Isles into Iceland and Greenland, they left behind ruins, art, language, and genetics, but not in the White Sea region. There, Viking DNA vanishes. Biarmian bloodlines persist. No intermarriage, no conquest, just avoidance. They didn't assimilate the Biarmians. They orbited around them, and yet, despite the bloodshed, what emerged over time was not total isolation, but careful coexistence. The Biarmians didn't seek empire, and the Vikings, after enough costly lessons, realized that trade was safer than war. Silent markets emerged, winter neutral zones. Goods were exchanged in complete silence. No bartering, no voices, just offerings, left on flat stones and the quiet hope that they'd be accepted. Even Norse cooking began to shift. Traces of Biarmian preservation techniques, particularly fermented fish and snow-smoking methods, appear in Viking cookware by the 11th century. Subtle, but unmistakable. We even see echoes of Biarmian architecture in distant Viking settlements. Semi-subterranean, homes built to conserve heat, mimic Biarmian efficiency. The influence was unspoken, but it was there. The people the Vikings feared were quietly teaching them how to survive. But of course, fear is never just about strength. It's about memory. The Varangian Chronicle tells us of a final great defeat, Thor, Hun's expedition of 1026 CE, that became something of a whispered legend in Norse circles. We've mentioned it briefly, but let's open that wound fully. Thor Hun was no fool. He led a force of 300 men, 3 longships, and carried both gifts and weapons. At first all went well, trade was established, peace respected. Then he made a fatal mistake. He touched what was sacred. Whether it was theft or ignorance or arrogance, we'll never know. But when Thor's men entered a forested clearing and disturbed what local Biarmians considered holy ground, retribution came with terrifying speed. From the trees, from the snow, from the places where the air seemed too still. Of the 3 ships that came, only one returned. Barely. Excavations near the site revealed the grim truth. A mass grave. Over 40 Viking skeletons, many with trauma to the back of the head. Attacked from behind, ambushed in the truest sense of the word. Some showed signs of frostbite, others of desperate attempts to flee. But what truly haunts archaeologists isn't the bones. It's what was missing. Not a single Biarmian body was found among them. This wasn't a battle. This was a message. Come no further. The Norse sagas, normally so eager to sing of glory, say very little. A few vague verses. A suggestion that Thor Hun vanished into the trees. That a wolf pack claimed him. That the White Forest kept what was offered. But among Norse traders, word spread. And after that year, they stopped coming. Instead, they moved south, deepening routes through the Russian rivers, founding trade posts that would later grow into Novgorod and Kiev. The Eastern Dream, the expansion into the White Sea territories, was over, not because it failed, but because it refused them. In this way, the Biarmians reshaped the very map of Viking ambition, and they did it without ever needing a navy, or a king, or a famous general. Just fire, snow, silence, and a culture of resilience so deeply rooted, it made even the most fearless warriors in history turn back. What's even more fascinating is how long the Biarmians held on. While many tribes faded, were conquered, or absorbed, Biarmian culture persisted well into the 12th century. Historical records and even recent DNA analyses confirm it. Their genetic imprint remains distinct. Their traditions echoed in the far north of Russia and Finland. They are one of the few peoples who stood before the Viking wave and didn't just survive. They held the line, but they did more than defend. They haunted. Norse mythology, for all its dragons and sea serpents, rarely mentions real fear. But the sagas that brush up against Biarmian stories carry a different tone, more hushed, more uncertain, less bravado. They don't say, "We lost." They say, "Don't go there." For the Norse, that was the loudest silence of all. It ends where it began, not in triumph or ruin, but in mystery. The Vikings, bold and brutal, believed themselves to be the greatest force in the known world, and for a time, they were. But in the northernmost reaches of that world, they met something different, something not greater perhaps, but stranger, unfathomable, immovable. The Biarmians didn't just stop Viking conquest, they erased the very will to continue it. The final Viking chronicles that mention the Biarmians are brief, as if even the ink feared to linger too long on the page. A chieftain's log from 1081 CE states simply, "We trade south now." The forest keeps its silence and we respect it. No war cry, no final raid, just a quiet retreat, not from battle, but from the edge of understanding. And this is what makes the Biarmian story so extraordinary. They were never the aggressors. They didn't sail west. They didn't build empires. They didn't write their own legends. But they became legend anyway. They didn't do it with dragons or magic. They did it with snow and shadows and silence. To the Vikings, who glorified war and conquest, this was worse than defeat. It was irrelevance. You see, the Norse culture was built on the idea that if you died well, your name would live forever. But the Biarmians didn't care for names. They cared for forests, for sacred stones, for balance. Where the Vikings saw opportunity, the Biarmians saw intrusion, and they responded not with speeches but with precision. There's an unsettling kind of peace in that. A clarity. In their absence from the written word, the Biarmians became something more powerful than a people. They became a question, a reminder, that not everything must be known. Not every land needs to be drawn on a map. That some stories whisper instead of shout, and still leave a deeper mark. Even now, in the vast wilderness along the Kola Peninsula and White Sea, archaeologists find remnants, bone tools designed for ice, animal hide footwear with retractable spikes, arrowheads with obsidian tips, still sharp after 1,000 years, carved stones hidden beneath moss, their patterns still undeciphered, settlements where the fire pits are, placed not for warmth, but for alignment with the stars, and the occasional Viking artifact, buried beneath layers of Biarmian design. Never above it, always beneath. It's a strange thing, to be feared by the people everyone feared. But the Biarmians didn't do it by becoming monsters. They did it by staying human, rooted, adapted, patient. They knew the land not as a place to conquer, but as something to live with. And that made all the difference, because in the end, empires burn, ships rot, but a cold forest can last forever. This story isn't just about lost tribes or raiders turned back. It's about how the strongest force isn't always the one with the loudest roar. Sometimes it's the one that whispers. We live in a time where expansion, visibility, and dominance are celebrated. We're told to always move forward, to always grow. But the Biarmians teach us something far older, far wiser. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay still. Know your place. Guard what matters. And let the world come to you. In a history written by victors, the Biarmians wrote their chapter by surviving, by being too quiet to conquer, too strange to assimilate, too sacred to erase. So if you ever find yourself walking alone in the northern woods and the wind suddenly dies, and the snow seems too still, and you hear nothing but your own breath, maybe, just maybe, you've stepped into a place the Vikings once feared to go, and if you listen closely, you might still hear the forest whisper, "Go back."